A man sits alone in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of molten metal and ink-stained wood. His hands are black with soot, his back aches from years of hunching over his work, and his purse is nearly empty. Outside, the world belongs to kings and priests, to those who can read and those who control what gets written. But in this cramped room in Mainz, Germany, in the year 1440, Johannes Gutenberg is about to change everything. He doesn't know it yet. How could he? He's just trying to solve a problem that's been eating at him for years. How do you make books faster? How do you spread knowledge to more than just the wealthy elite? How do you give voice to ideas that have been locked away in monastery libraries for centuries? What he's creating in that workshop will do more than just make books. It will topple empires, birth revolutions, and fundamentally alter the course of human civilization. But right now, all he knows is that he's running out of money and time is running short. This is the story of how one man's obsession gave birth to the modern world. This is the story of the printing press. To understand the magnitude of what Gutenberg achieved, you have to understand the world he was born into. Imagine a world where books are so precious that they're chained to library shelves, where a single Bible takes a scribe 2 years to complete by hand and costs more than a house, where knowledge is hoarded by the powerful like gold in a vault. In medieval Europe, literacy was a luxury of the elite. The church controlled most written knowledge, and they guarded it jealously. Monks spent their entire lives copying manuscripts word by word, letter by letter, in dim monastery scriptoriums. Their hands would cramp, their eyes would strain, and sometimes they'd die before finishing a single book. Each manuscript was unique, beautiful, and extraordinarily rare. If you were a common person, a farmer, a blacksmith, a merchant, the written word might as well have been magic. You lived in a world of oral tradition, where stories and knowledge passed from mouth to mouth, changing and evolving with each telling. The vast libraries of classical antiquity, the philosophical works of ancient Greece and Rome, the scientific treatises that could transform agriculture or medicine, all of this remained locked away, accessible only to a privileged few. This was the world that shaped Johannes Gutenberg's early life. Born around 1400 into a patrician family in Mainz, he grew up watching goldsmiths and metalworkers ply their trade. His father was involved in the local mint, and young Johannes absorbed the intricate knowledge of working with metals, casting coins, and creating precise, detailed objects from molten alloys. But Johannes was restless. He could see the inefficiency all around him. He watched scribes laboring over manuscripts, creating one copy at a time. He saw how knowledge moved like cold honey, slowly, expensively, and only to those who could afford it. There had to be a better way. The spark of inspiration didn't come all at once. It was born from necessity and nurtured by desperation. Gutenberg had tried his hand at various business ventures, mirror making, gemstone polishing, but nothing brought him the success he craved. By his 40s, he was struggling financially, borrowing money and looking for the breakthrough that would change his fortune. Then came the idea that would change everything: movable type. The concept wasn't entirely new. The Chinese had been experimenting with printing for centuries, using wooden blocks carved with entire pages of text. But Gutenberg envisioned something revolutionary: individual letters cast in metal that could be arranged and rearranged to form any words, any sentences, any ideas. Instead of carving a new block for every page, you could simply rearrange the same letters over and over again. It sounds simple now, but in 1440, it was like trying to split the atom with your bare hands. First, Gutenberg had to solve the metallurgy. What alloy would hold fine detail but remain durable enough for thousands of impressions? After countless experiments, he developed a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony that was perfect. Hard enough to maintain sharp edges, soft enough to cast precisely, and cheap enough to produce in quantity. Then came the challenge of the letters themselves. Each piece of type had to be exactly the same height, or the printing would be uneven. The letters had to be perfectly uniform, or words would look crooked on the page. And they had to be cast in reverse, mirror images of themselves, so they would print correctly. Gutenberg spent months perfecting his type molds, creating what he called a hand mold, a precision instrument that could cast identical letters with mechanical accuracy. Every letter of the alphabet, every punctuation mark, every space had to be crafted with obsessive attention to detail. But even perfect type was useless without the right ink. The water-based inks used by scribes wouldn't adhere properly to metal type. Gutenberg had to develop an oil-based ink that would stick to metal, transfer cleanly to paper, and dry without smudging. He mixed linseed oil with soot and other pigments, creating an ink that was both durable and rich in color. And then there was the press itself. Gutenberg adapted the design of wine presses common in the Rhine Valley, creating a machine that could apply even pressure across an entire page. The screw mechanism allowed precise control over the pressure, ensuring that every letter would make clear contact with the paper. By 1450, after years of refinement and experimentation, Gutenberg was ready to attempt something that had never been done before. He chose the Bible, partly because it guaranteed a ready market among churches and monasteries, but also because it represented the ultimate test of his technology. The Bible was long, complex, and had to be perfect. Any errors would not just be embarrassing, they would be blasphemous. The project consumed 3 years of his life. Working with a small team of assistants, Gutenberg set and reset thousands of pieces of type, printed sheet after sheet, and bound the finished pages into books. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Each page had to be proofread multiple times. The ink had to be mixed fresh. The paper had to be dampened to just the right consistency. What emerged from that workshop in 1455 was nothing short of miraculous. The Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible for the number of lines on each page. It was beautiful beyond anything that had been produced before, more uniform than hand-copied manuscripts, yet retaining the elegance and dignity that people expected from Holy Scripture. But here's the tragic irony of the story. Johannes Gutenberg, the man who would democratize knowledge and transform the world, was himself destroyed by debt. His business partner and financier, Johann Fust, had grown impatient with the slow progress and enormous expenses of the Bible project. In 1455, just as the Bibles were being completed, Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment of his loans. The court case was devastating. Gutenberg lost control of his printing equipment, his type, and even many of the Bibles he had spent years creating. Imagine the heartbreak, to create something revolutionary only to have it taken away just as you're about to reap the rewards. Gutenberg spent his final years in relative obscurity, working as a minor court official in Mainz, while others used his invention to build fortunes and spread ideas across Europe. He died around 1468, probably never fully understanding the magnitude of what he had unleashed upon the world. But what he had unleashed was extraordinary. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's first Bible, printing presses had spread across Europe like wildfire. By 1500, there were printing shops in over 200 cities, and an estimated 8 million books had been produced, more books than had been created in the entire previous history of Western civilization. The impact was immediate and profound. Ideas that had been locked away in monastery libraries suddenly became available to anyone who could read. Classical texts that had been lost for centuries were rediscovered and reprinted. New ideas could spread across continents in months rather than decades. The Protestant Reformation was made possible by the printing press. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, printed copies spread across Germany in weeks and across Europe in months. For the first time in history, a religious reformer could speak directly to the masses, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge. Luther understood the power of this new technology. He wrote in German rather than Latin, making his ideas accessible to ordinary people. He used simple, powerful language and created pamphlets that could be produced cheaply and distributed widely. Printing, he said, is God's latest and ultimate gift by which he would have his gospel proclaimed to the ends of the earth. The Catholic Church, which had controlled the flow of religious knowledge for over 1,000 years, suddenly found itself in an information war it was losing. They tried to control printing through censorship and licensing, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket. Ideas, once printed, took on a life of their own. The scientific revolution followed close behind. Copernicus could publish his theory that the Earth revolved around the sun, and despite church opposition, his ideas spread and evolved. Galileo's observations, Newton's mathematics, and countless other scientific breakthroughs could be shared, verified, and built upon by scholars across Europe. But perhaps most importantly, the printing press began to create something that had never existed before: an informed public. As books became cheaper and more available, literacy rates soared. People who had never had access to written knowledge suddenly found themselves reading everything from religious texts to practical manuals to works of literature. This literate public became the foundation of everything we now take for granted: democracy, scientific progress, individual rights, public education. You cannot govern an educated population the way you govern an ignorant one. When people can read different opinions, compare different arguments, and think for themselves, the old systems of authority begin to crumble. The printing press didn't just spread existing knowledge, it accelerated the creation of new knowledge. Scientists could build on each other's work more rapidly. Scholars could engage in debates across vast distances. The pace of human progress, which had crawled along for centuries, suddenly accelerated into a sprint. Consider the impact on exploration and navigation. Printed maps and sailing instructions meant that knowledge gained by one explorer could immediately benefit all others. The age of discovery was powered not just by better ships and navigational instruments, but by better information sharing. The same was true for commerce, agriculture, medicine, and engineering. Printed books allowed knowledge to accumulate and spread in ways that had never been possible when everything depended on hand-copied manuscripts and oral tradition. But the printing press also had darker consequences that Gutenberg could never have foreseen. The same technology that spread enlightenment also spread propaganda. The same presses that printed Bibles also printed pamphlets calling for religious wars. The same system that democratized knowledge also made possible the mass distribution of hatred and misinformation. The religious wars that tore Europe apart in the 16th and 17th centuries were fueled by printed propaganda. Each side used the press to demonize their enemies and rally their supporters. The technology that had promised to bring truth to the masses also proved capable of spreading lies at unprecedented speed and scale. This tension between the liberating and destructive potential of mass communication would echo through history. The same questions that emerged in Gutenberg's time continue to challenge us today in our digital age. How do we preserve the benefits of free information while controlling its harmful effects? How do we distinguish truth from falsehood when both can spread with equal speed? How do we maintain social cohesion when everyone has access to different sources of information? By the time of Gutenberg's death, the transformation was already unstoppable. The old world of controlled information was dying, and a new world of mass communication was being born. Knowledge which had been hoarded like treasure was becoming a common resource. Ideas which had moved at the speed of horses now moved at the speed of production and distribution. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment,
All of these great movements in human history were made possible by Gutenberg's invention. The books that emerged from his press and the thousands of presses that followed didn't just contain ideas, they created the conditions in which new ideas could flourish. Think about the individual human stories behind this transformation. A farmer's son who learned to read could now access the same knowledge as a noble's child. A merchant in London could read about the discoveries of an explorer in Lisbon. A scholar in Prague could engage in philosophical debates with thinkers in Paris, even if they never met face to face. For the first time in human history, your station in life didn't completely determine your access to knowledge. If you could read, and increasingly people made enormous sacrifices to learn how, you could participate in the great conversations of your time. You could learn about distant lands, examine different religious ideas, study new methods of farming or crafting, or simply lose yourself in stories and poems. The printing press created what we now call the Republic of Letters, a community of thinkers and readers that transcended national and religious boundaries. This republic had no capital, no army, no flag, but it was more powerful than many kingdoms because it was built on ideas rather than force. Women, who had been largely excluded from formal education, found new opportunities in this world of books. While they still faced enormous barriers, the availability of printed books meant that a determined woman could educate herself in ways that had been impossible before. Some, like Christine de Pizan, became successful authors whose printed works reached audiences across Europe. The economic implications were equally profound. The printing industry created entirely new categories of jobs: type founders, printers, proofreaders, booksellers, paper makers. Entire neighborhoods in major cities became devoted to the book trade. Fortunes were made and lost in the speculation around which books would sell and which would gather dust. Publishers became powerful figures, deciding which ideas would reach the public and which would remain in manuscript form. They were the first mass media moguls, wielding influence through their control over what got printed and distributed. The printing press also transformed the nature of authorship itself. Before printing, most books were anonymous or attributed to ancient authorities. The concept of intellectual property barely existed. But printing created economic incentives for original thinking and writing. Authors could now reach large audiences and, eventually, make livings from their work. This economic dimension encouraged innovation and creativity in ways that the old system never could. Why spend years writing a book if only a few dozen people would ever read it? But if your book could be printed in hundreds or thousands of copies and sold across Europe, suddenly writing became a viable career. The transformation wasn't limited to Europe. European missionaries and colonizers carried printing presses to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Indigenous languages were written down for the first time. Local stories and traditions were preserved in print. But the same technology was also used to spread European ideas and values, contributing to the cultural disruption that accompanied European expansion.
In the Americas, the printing press played a crucial role in the development of colonial identity and eventually revolutionary ideology. The pamphlets and newspapers that spread ideas about independence and self-governance were direct descendants of Gutenberg's innovation. The American Revolution was fought as much with printed words as with muskets and cannons. The same pattern repeated around the world. Wherever printing presses appeared, they accelerated social and political change. They spread new ideas about governance, religion, and social organization. They created literate populations that were harder to control and more likely to demand participation in their own governance. As we reach the end of our story, it's important to recognize that the printing press was not just a technological innovation, it was a fundamentally humanizing force. By making knowledge more accessible, it affirmed the dignity and potential of ordinary people. It suggested that wisdom was not the exclusive property of priests and princes, but something that could be shared by all humanity. Gutenberg's legacy is written not just in the books that descended from his press, but in every library, every school, every newspaper, and every person who has ever learned to read. His workshop in Mainz was the birthplace of mass education, democratic government,
scientific progress, and the modern world itself. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Gutenberg's story is how human it is. He wasn't a superhuman genius or a divinely inspired prophet. He was a craftsman, an entrepreneur who saw a problem and dedicated his life to solving it. He faced the same challenges we all face: financial pressure, technical difficulties, skeptical investors, and jealous competitors. He died without seeing the full impact of his work, but he left behind something more valuable than wealth or fame. He left behind a technology that continues to transform human civilization more than 500 years after his death. Today, as we grapple with our own information revolution, we can learn from Gutenberg's example. The digital technologies that connect us, inform us, and sometimes overwhelm us are the direct descendants of his printing press. The challenges we face, information overload, the spread of misinformation, the democratization of publishing, are the same challenges that emerged in his time. Like the people of Gutenberg's era, we're learning to navigate a world where information moves faster than wisdom, where anyone can be a publisher, and where the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge have lost much of their power. The solutions aren't simple, but the stakes are just as high as they were in 1440. The printing press reminds us that technology is not neutral. It amplifies human nature, both good and bad. Gutenberg's invention spread enlightenment and ignorance, truth and propaganda, tolerance and hatred. What matters is not the technology itself, but how we choose to use it. In the end, Johannes Gutenberg's greatest achievement was not the mechanical ingenuity of his press or the beauty of his Bible. It was his faith in the power of human reason and the value of shared knowledge. He believed that if you gave people access to information, they would use it wisely. He believed that knowledge belonged not to the powerful few, but to all humanity. That belief, cast in metal type and pressed onto paper in a workshop in Mainz, changed the world forever. And in our own age of information revolution, it remains our best guide for the future. As Victor Hugo would later write, "Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come." In 1440, in the hands of a debt-ridden inventor in Germany, the time had come for the printing press, and with it came the modern world, messy, chaotic, democratic, and gloriously human. But there's so much more to this story that deserves to be told. The ripple effects of Gutenberg's invention didn't stop with the obvious changes. They penetrated into the very fabric of human consciousness itself. Let me take you deeper into the world that printing created, because to truly understand its impact, we need to see how it changed not just what people knew, but how they thought. Before the printing press, memory was everything. In a world where books were rare and expensive, people developed extraordinary powers of recall. Scholars could recite entire texts from memory. Storytellers could perform epic poems that lasted for hours without missing a word. The human mind was a library, and forgetting was a form of death. But printing changed that relationship with memory forever. Why memorize entire books when you could simply refer to them? This shift was both liberating and terrifying. Critics of the time warned that printing would make people lazy, that it would weaken the human capacity for deep thought and reflection. They weren't entirely wrong. When you no longer need to memorize the Iliad, you lose something profound: the intimate relationship between mind and text that comes from having words literally become part of you. But what humanity gained was far greater than what it lost. By freeing the mind from the burden of storage, printing allowed it to focus on analysis, creativity, and innovation. Think about what this meant for a young person in the late 15th century. Instead of spending years memorizing ancient texts, they could read them quickly and move on to comparing different ideas, questioning authorities, and developing their own thoughts. The human mind, liberated from being a warehouse, could become a workshop. This transformation in thinking patterns had profound effects on every aspect of human culture. Art began to change as artists could study printed treatises on perspective, anatomy, and technique. They could examine reproductions of works from other cities and countries, leading to the rapid spread of artistic innovations. The Renaissance explosion of artistic achievement was powered not just by individual genius, but by the unprecedented sharing of knowledge that printing made possible. The same was true for music. Printed musical notation meant that a composer in Italy could have their work performed in Germany or England. Musical styles and innovations spread rapidly across Europe, leading to the rich flowering of Renaissance and Baroque music that still moves us today.
But perhaps nowhere was the impact more dramatic than in the world of science and medicine. Before printing, a physician might spend their entire career with access to perhaps a dozen medical texts, many of them copied incorrectly by scribes who didn't understand the subject matter. Imagine trying to perform surgery based on a medical text that had been copied by hand 17 times, with each scribe introducing new errors. Printing changed this overnight. Anatomical drawings could be reproduced accurately. Medical discoveries could be shared immediately across Europe. A physician in Padua could read about a new surgical technique developed in Paris, try it themselves, and then publish their own improvements for others to build upon. The speed of scientific progress accelerated dramatically. Where it might have taken centuries for a medical advance to spread throughout Europe, it now took months or years. The printing press didn't just preserve knowledge, it created a system for the rapid accumulation and improvement of knowledge. Consider the story of Andreas Vesalius, the great Renaissance anatomist. In the 1540s, he revolutionized medical education by insisting that students should learn anatomy through direct observation of human bodies, rather than by reading ancient texts. But his work would have remained limited to his own students, if not for printing. Vesalius published his masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, in 1543. This wasn't just a text, it was a visual revolution. The book contained incredibly detailed anatomical illustrations that were far more accurate than anything that had come before. These illustrations were engraved on wood blocks with extraordinary precision, showing the human body as it actually was, rather than as ancient authorities had described it. The impact was immediate and profound. Medical schools across Europe began to change their teaching methods. Students could now see accurate representations of organs, bones, and blood vessels. Surgeons could plan operations with unprecedented precision. The entire foundation of medical knowledge began to shift from ancient authority to direct observation. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Vesalius was challenging Galen, a physician who had lived 1,400 years earlier and whose work had been accepted without question throughout the medieval period. Galen had never actually dissected human bodies. He had based his anatomical knowledge on animal dissections and theoretical speculation. Yet his authority had been so absolute that questioning him was considered almost heretical. The printing press gave Vesalius the power to challenge this ancient authority, not through argument, but through evidence. His printed anatomical illustrations were so clearly accurate that they couldn't be ignored or dismissed. This represented a fundamental shift in how knowledge was validated, from who said it to whether it could be proven. This same pattern repeated across every field of human knowledge. In astronomy, Copernicus could challenge the geocentric model not just with words, but with detailed mathematical calculations that could be studied and verified by other astronomers. In geography, printed maps became increasingly accurate as explorers could share their discoveries immediately with map makers. The printing press created what we might call the first global information network. A discovery made in one part of Europe could be known in every other part within months. This unprecedented speed of information sharing created a kind of collective intelligence that had never existed before. But the transformation went deeper than just the sharing of facts and discoveries. Printing changed the very nature of how people related to authority and truth. In the medieval world, truth was hierarchical. God was the ultimate source of truth, followed by the church, then ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen, then local authorities like kings and nobles.
Knowledge flowed downward from higher to lower authorities, and questioning this hierarchy was not just intellectually dangerous, it was spiritually and politically dangerous as well. The printing press shattered this hierarchy. When anyone could publish their ideas, when readers could compare different authorities side by side, when evidence and reason became more important than tradition and status, the old systems of intellectual authority began to crumble. This wasn't just an abstract philosophical change. It had immediate, practical consequences that touched every person's daily life. Take the example of agriculture, which employed the vast majority of people in medieval Europe. For centuries, farming techniques had been passed down through oral tradition and practical experience. Farmers knew when to plant and harvest, how to care for animals, and how to preserve food through the winter, but this knowledge was local and limited. A technique that worked well in Italy might be unknown in England, even if it could have solved persistent problems there. Printing changed this completely. Agricultural manuals began to appear in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, sharing farming innovations across vast distances. A new method of crop rotation developed in the Netherlands could be implemented by farmers in Poland. Innovations in animal husbandry could spread from Germany to Spain. The impact on food production was enormous. Better farming techniques meant more food, which meant larger populations, which meant more people available for other kinds of work. The printing press didn't just change intellectual life, it helped fuel the population growth and economic expansion that would transform Europe over the following centuries. The same pattern occurred in every craft and trade. Printers began publishing technical manuals for everything from metalworking to weaving to shipbuilding. Knowledge that had been closely guarded by craft guilds suddenly became available to anyone who could read. This democratization of technical knowledge accelerated innovation and economic growth in ways that would have been impossible under the old system. But perhaps the most profound change was in how ordinary people began to see themselves and their place in the world. In a society where knowledge was scarce and controlled, most people accepted their station in life as divinely ordained and unchangeable. If you were born a peasant, you expected to die a peasant. The printing press began to change these assumptions. When people could read different opinions, compare different arguments, and access knowledge that had previously been restricted to the elite, they began to see themselves as capable of independent thought and judgment. This transformation in consciousness was gradual but irresistible. Each generation that grew up with access to printed books was slightly more independent, slightly more questioning, and slightly more confident in their own intellectual abilities than the generation before. The psychological impact of this change cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, ordinary people began to believe that they could understand complex ideas, form their own opinions, and even challenge the wisdom of their supposed betters. This was the birth of what we now call individualism, the idea that each person has inherent worth and dignity and the right to think for themselves. This intellectual revolution created the conditions for political revolution as well. The American colonists who declared independence from Britain were the inheritors of a centuries-long tradition of questioning authority that began with Gutenberg's press. When Thomas Paine published Common Sense in 1776, advocating for American independence, he was using the same technology and appealing to the same spirit of independent thinking that had been growing since the 15th century. The pamphlet sold over 120,000 copies in the first 3 months, an extraordinary number for a colonial population of only 2.5 million people. But more importantly, it demonstrated how printed ideas could mobilize ordinary people to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. The American Revolution was, in many ways, the political culmination of the intellectual revolution that began with the printing press. But we must also confront the darker aspects of this transformation, because the printing press was not an unmitigated good. The same technology that spread enlightenment also spread hatred. The same system that democratized knowledge also democratized ignorance. The religious wars that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries were fueled by printed propaganda that demonized religious opponents and inflamed popular passions. Protestant reformers used printing to spread their message, but Catholic authorities used the same technology to organize counterattacks. Both sides produced pamphlets and books that portrayed their enemies as agents of Satan, deserving of the most brutal treatment. The result was a century and a half of religious warfare that killed millions of people and devastated entire regions of Europe. The same printing presses that produced Bibles and scientific treatises also produced hate literature that made compromise and coexistence nearly impossible. This pattern would repeat throughout history. The printing press that spread the ideas of the Enlightenment also spread the racist ideologies that justified slavery and colonialism. The technology that made possible the scientific revolution also made possible the rapid dissemination of pseudo-scientific theories about racial superiority and inferiority. In the 19th and 20th centuries, totalitarian movements would use mass printing to spread propaganda on an unprecedented scale. Hitler's Mein Kampf was a printed book. Stalin's cult of personality was built through printed newspapers and pamphlets. The genocides and mass murders of the modern era were often preceded and accompanied by printed materials designed to dehumanize victims and mobilize perpetrators. This dark side of the printing revolution forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the relationship between technology and morality. Tools are not inherently good or evil. They amplify human intentions, both noble and base. The printing press gave humanity unprecedented power to share ideas, but it also gave unprecedented power to those who would manipulate and deceive. Yet, even acknowledging these dark chapters, the overall impact of printing on human civilization has been overwhelmingly positive. The spread of literacy, the acceleration of scientific progress, the development of democratic institutions, the recognition of individual rights, all of these advances that we take for granted were made possible by Gutenberg's invention. The printing press created the intellectual infrastructure for everything we consider modern and civilized. It made possible the university system that educates our children, the scientific method that advances our knowledge, the free press that holds our leaders accountable, and the libraries that preserve our cultural heritage. To understand just how revolutionary this was, imagine if all printed books suddenly disappeared tomorrow. Not just the physical books, but the entire intellectual tradition they represent. Imagine if we lost not only the books themselves, but the habits of mind that printing created, the assumption that knowledge should be shared, that authorities should be questioned, that evidence matters more than tradition. We would be back in Gutenberg's world of 1440, where knowledge was scarce, authority was absolute, and most people lived and died without ever being exposed to ideas beyond their immediate community. The difference between that world and ours is the difference that one man's invention made. But Gutenberg's legacy extends beyond the books that came from his press. He also created a template for how technological innovation can transform society. His story shows us that the most powerful inventions are often those that democratize access to something that was previously restricted to elites. The printing press democratized knowledge. The steam engine democratized transportation. The telephone democratized communication. The computer democratized information processing. The internet democratized publishing and distribution. Each of these innovations followed the same basic pattern that Gutenberg established, taking something that was expensive, difficult, and restricted and making it cheap, easy, and widely available. This pattern of democratization through technology continues to drive social change today. The smartphone in your pocket gives you access to more information than was available to kings and emperors throughout most of human history. Social media platforms allow anyone to broadcast their ideas to potentially millions of people. Online education makes it possible for someone in a remote village to take courses from the world's best universities. These modern innovations raise the same questions that emerged in Gutenberg's time. How do we distinguish valuable information from worthless noise? How do we prevent the spread of harmful misinformation? How do we maintain social cohesion when everyone has access to different sources of information? How do we preserve the benefits of democratized communication while minimizing its dangers? The answers aren't simple, but Gutenberg's example provides guidance. He succeeded not because he had perfect solutions to these problems, but because he had faith in human potential. He believed that if you gave people access to knowledge, most of them would use it wisely. He believed that the benefits of democratizing information would outweigh the risks. History has largely vindicated that faith. The world that printing created, despite all its flaws and tragedies, is more prosperous, more educated, more free, and more humane than the world that came before. We live longer, healthier lives. We have greater opportunities for personal fulfillment. We have more protection from arbitrary authority. We have access to the accumulated wisdom of our entire species. None of this would have been possible without the revolution that began in a workshop in mines more than 500 years ago. As we face our own information revolution in the digital age, we can take inspiration from Gutenberg's example. Like him, we are living through a time when the fundamental nature of human communication is changing. Like him, we face both extraordinary opportunities and serious dangers. Like him, we must have the courage to embrace change while working to guide it in positive directions. The technologies we create today will shape the world our children and grandchildren inherit, just as Gutenberg's press shaped the world we inherited. The choices we make about how to use these technologies, how to regulate them, how to educate people about them, how to ensure they serve human flourishing rather than human destruction, will determine whether future generations look back on our era as a time of enlightenment or a time of chaos. Gutenberg's story reminds us that individual actions can have world-changing consequences. One person working in a small workshop with limited resources can create something that transforms the entire trajectory of human civilization. But it also reminds us that such transformations are never the work of a single individual. They require the contributions of countless others who recognize the potential of new technologies and work to realize that potential. The scribes who learned to use Gutenberg's press, the investors who funded its expansion, the scholars who wrote books for it to print, the readers who bought and treasured those books, all of them played essential roles in the revolution that followed. Gutenberg provided the spark, but it took an entire civilization to kindle the flame. Today, we are all participants in a similar revolution. The choices we make about how to use and regulate digital technologies will determine their ultimate impact on human society. We can choose to use these tools to spread knowledge and understanding, or to spread ignorance and hatred. We can use them to connect people across boundaries of race, religion, and nationality, or to divide them into hostile camps. We can use them to empower individuals and communities, or to concentrate power in the hands of a few. The technology itself is neutral. What matters is how we choose to use it. And that choice, like the choice Gutenberg made in his workshop in mines, will echo through the centuries and shape the world for generations to come. But let me tell you about the untold stories, the human faces behind this revolution that history often forgets. Because while we remember Gutenberg's name, there were thousands of others whose lives were forever changed by his invention, and their stories revealed the true depth of this transformation. Consider Anna, a baker's daughter in Frankfurt in 1480. In the Old World, she would have lived and died knowing only the prayers taught to her by the local priest, the recipes passed down from her mother, and the gossip of her neighborhood. But Anna lived in the age of printing. At 17, she taught herself to read using a cheap printed primer that cost less than a day's wages. By 20, she was reading everything she could get her hands on: religious texts, stories of distant lands, treatises on herb cultivation. Anna's story was repeated thousands of times across Europe. The printing press didn't just change what the elite knew, it fundamentally altered the inner lives of ordinary people. For the first time in human history, a baker's daughter could access the same ideas as a nobleman's son. She could read the same books, contemplate the same questions, and dream the same dreams. This democratization of imagination was perhaps printing's most profound gift to humanity. When books became affordable, people's mental horizons expanded beyond their physical horizons. A farmer in rural England could read about the spice markets of Venice, the philosophy of ancient Athens, or the exploration of the New World. The human mind, no longer confined by geography or social class, began to roam freely across space and time. Think about what this meant for human creativity and innovation. In the manuscript era, most people were exposed to perhaps a dozen different ideas in their entire lifetime. But in the age of printing, a curious individual could encounter hundreds of different perspectives, philosophies, and ways of understanding the world. This explosion of intellectual input led to an explosion of creative output. The Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering ancient texts. It was about the unprecedented mixing and recombining of ideas that became possible when knowledge could flow freely. An artist could study mathematical treatises on perspective, philosophical works on the nature of beauty, and practical manuals on pigment preparation. Then synthesize all of these influences into something entirely new. The same creative explosion occurred in every field touched by printing. Composers could study musical theory from multiple traditions, leading to innovations in harmony and structure. Engineers could combine insights from mechanics, mathematics, and metallurgy to create new machines. Merchants could apply lessons from geography, economics, and navigation to develop new trade routes and business methods. But perhaps nowhere was this creative synthesis more dramatic than in the emergence of what we now call science. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries wasn't just about new discoveries. It was about a new way of thinking that became possible only when scholars could easily access and compare the work of their predecessors and contemporaries. Consider Galileo Galilei, peering through his telescope at the moons of Jupiter in 1610. His observations were revolutionary, but what made them truly transformative was his ability to immediately publish and defend his findings. Within months of his discoveries, printed copies of his Sidereus Nuncius, Starry Messenger, were circulating throughout Europe, forcing astronomers everywhere to grapple with evidence that challenged the foundations of their worldview. But Galileo's story also reveals the tensions and conflicts that printing created. The same technology that allowed him to spread his ideas also allowed his opponents to organize against him. The Inquisition used printed texts to marshal arguments against heliocentrism, and they ultimately forced Galileo to recant his views under threat of torture and death. This conflict between new knowledge and established authority played out countless times in the centuries following Gutenberg's invention. Each new generation of thinkers pushed the boundaries of acceptable thought a little further, while conservative forces used the same printing technology to resist change and maintain traditional beliefs. The result was a kind of intellectual arms race, with both sides constantly improving their arguments, refining their evidence, and appealing to an increasingly educated public.
This competition of ideas, made possible by printing, drove the rapid advancement of human knowledge in ways that had never been possible before. The transformation extended far beyond the realm of high intellectual culture. Printing changed the most intimate aspects of human life: how people fell in love, how they raised their children, how they understood their own emotions and desires. Romance literature, made affordable by printing, created new expectations about love and marriage. Young people who had previously accepted arranged marriages based on economic considerations began to dream of passionate love matches based on personal choice. The very concept of romantic love as we understand it today was largely created and spread through printed books. Parenting guides gave mothers and fathers new ideas about child rearing. Medical manuals provided information about health and hygiene that had previously been available only to physicians. Religious texts allowed individuals to develop personal relationships with the divine that didn't depend entirely on priestly mediation. Even something as basic as how people structured their daily lives was transformed by printing. Before clocks became common, most people organized their days around natural rhythms: sunrise, sunset, meal times, seasonal changes. But printed almanacs and calendars created new ways of thinking about time. People began to plan their activities weeks or months in advance, to coordinate their schedules with others across vast distances, and to think of time as something that could be managed and optimized. This transformation in temporal consciousness was crucial for the development of modern economic life. Complex commercial enterprises require the ability to coordinate activities across space and time, and this became possible only when people could share detailed written plans and schedules. The rise of capitalism and the modern economy would have been impossible without the precise coordination that printing made possible. The printing press also transformed the nature of collective memory and cultural identity. Before printing, communities preserved their histories through oral tradition, with all the flexibility and uncertainty that entailed. Stories changed in the telling. Heroes became larger than life, and the boundary between history and legend remained perpetually blurred. Printing brought both gains and losses to this process. On one hand, it allowed for the preservation of accurate historical records that could be consulted and verified by future generations. The chronicles and documents that were printed in the 15th and 16th centuries remain our primary sources for understanding that period today.
But printing also fixed cultural narratives in ways that oral tradition never did. Once a particular version of events was printed and widely distributed, it became much harder for communities to adapt their stories to changing circumstances. The flexibility that had allowed oral cultures to reinterpret their past in light of their present was partially lost. This had profound implications for how different groups understood their place in the world. Printed chronicles often reflected the perspectives of those who could afford to commission them, usually the wealthy and powerful. Alternative viewpoints, particularly those of common people, women, and marginalized groups, were less likely to be preserved in print. Yet at the same time, printing created new opportunities for these marginalized voices to be heard. Once the technology became widespread, it became possible for anyone with sufficient determination and resources to publish their own version of events. This led to an ongoing struggle over historical narrative that continues to this day. The religious implications of this struggle were enormous. The Catholic Church had maintained its authority partly through its control over religious narrative, the stories of saints, the interpretation of Scripture, the understanding of church history. When printing made it possible for reformers to publish alternative versions of these narratives, the Church's monopoly on religious truth began to crumble. Martin Luther's success wasn't just due to his theological insights, it was due to his mastery of printing as a medium. He wrote in vernacular German rather than scholarly Latin, used simple and direct language that ordinary people could understand, and produced pamphlets that were cheap enough for common people to afford. His opponents, trained in the formal scholastic tradition, were slow to adapt to this new form of communication. The result was a religious revolution that split Christianity permanently and changed the political map of Europe. But the deeper change was in how people related to religious authority itself. Once individuals could read Scripture for themselves, they inevitably began to interpret it for themselves. The priesthood of all believers, a key Protestant doctrine, was not just a theological position, it was a practical consequence of widespread literacy. This pattern of democratization through printing extended to every form of cultural authority. Legal knowledge, previously restricted to trained lawyers and judges, became accessible to ordinary citizens through printed law books and legal guides. Medical knowledge, once the exclusive province of university-trained physicians, spread to barber surgeons, midwives, and ordinary people through printed medical manuals. The guilds that had controlled various crafts and trades found their monopolies on technical knowledge challenged by printed handbooks that revealed their closely guarded secrets. The entire medieval system of knowledge transmission through apprenticeship and oral instruction began to break down as printed text made it possible to learn complex skills without years of direct mentorship. This transformation created both opportunities and anxieties. On one hand, it democratized access to valuable knowledge and skills, allowing people to improve their lives and pursue their interests in ways that had never been possible before. On the other hand, it undermined traditional forms of authority and social organization that had provided stability and meaning for centuries. The psychological impact of this change was profound. People who had lived in stable hierarchical communities where everyone knew their place suddenly found themselves in a world where traditional roles and relationships were constantly being questioned and redefined. The printing press didn't just change what people knew, it changed who they thought they were and what they believed was possible. This identity crisis played out differently in different parts of Europe. In regions where traditional authorities adapted successfully to the new information environment, the transition was relatively smooth. But in areas where established powers tried to resist change, the result was often conflict and upheaval. The German Peasants' War of 1524-1525 was partly fueled by printed pamphlets that spread new ideas about social justice and religious reform among rural populations. The peasants who rose up against their lords were inspired by printed works that challenged traditional notions of social hierarchy and argued for more egalitarian arrangements. The revolt was ultimately crushed, but it demonstrated the revolutionary potential of printed ideas when they reached people who had previously been excluded from intellectual and political life. The authorities at the time understood this threat clearly. They established censorship systems and book licensing requirements specifically to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. But censorship in the age of printing was like trying to hold back the tide with a screen door. Books could be printed in one country and smuggled into another. Ideas that were banned in one city could flourish in the next. The decentralized nature of printing made comprehensive censorship virtually impossible. This resistance to control was one of printing's most important characteristics. Unlike other forms of mass communication that would come later, radio, television, the internet, printing technology was relatively simple and inexpensive. Anyone with modest resources could set up a printing press and begin producing books, pamphlets, or broadsheets.
This decentralization had profound implications for the development of democratic institutions. In societies where information could be controlled by central authorities, democratic government was virtually impossible. How could people make informed choices about their leaders if they only had access to officially approved information? But in societies where printing had created multiple sources of information and opinion, citizens could compare different perspectives and make more informed judgments. The emergence of newspapers in the 17th and 18th centuries created a new form of public discourse that was essential for the development of democratic politics. The coffee houses of London, the salons of Paris, and the taverns of colonial America became centers of political discussion, where people gathered to read newspapers, debate current events, and form opinions about public affairs. This new public sphere, made possible by printing, created the conditions in which democratic movements could emerge and flourish. But democracy wasn't the only political system that benefited from printing. Absolute monarchs also learned to use the technology to strengthen their power. They commissioned printed works that glorified their reigns, established official newspapers that promoted their policies, and used broadsheets to communicate directly with their subjects.
The key difference was that in democratic societies, printing served to multiply and diversify sources of information, while in authoritarian societies, it was used primarily to amplify and spread official messages. The technology itself was neutral. What mattered was the political and social context in which it was deployed. This lesson remains relevant today as we grapple with the political implications of digital technologies. Like printing in the 15th century, the internet and social media can serve either democratic or authoritarian purposes depending on how they are regulated and used. As we near the end of our journey through the world that printing created, it's worth reflecting on what this story teaches us about the nature of technological change and human progress. Gutenberg's invention succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it solved real problems that people faced in their daily lives. Books were expensive and rare. Printing made them cheap and abundant. Knowledge was controlled by elites. Printing democratized access to information. Ideas spread slowly and unreliably. Printing created rapid and accurate transmission of thoughts across vast distances. But success also created new problems that Gutenberg could never have anticipated. The same technology that spread knowledge also spread misinformation. The same system that democratized access to information also made it harder to distinguish truth from falsehood. The same innovation that empowered individuals also undermined traditional sources of authority and social stability. These tensions weren't bugs in the system. They were features. The creative destruction that printing brought to medieval society was painful and disruptive, but it was also necessary for the emergence of the modern world. The old systems had to break down before new and better systems could take their place. This pattern of creative destruction continues to characterize technological innovation today. Each new wave of technological change, from the steam engine to the computer to the internet, brings both benefits and costs, opportunities and dangers, progress and disruption. The key insight from Gutenberg's story is that we cannot avoid these trade-offs, but we can influence how they play out. The printing press was going to transform society regardless of what anyone wanted or planned. But the specific ways in which it transformed society were shaped by the choices that people made about how to use and regulate the technology. The same is true today. Digital technologies are going to continue transforming our world whether we like it or not. But we still have choices about what forms that transformation will take. We can choose to use these tools to spread knowledge or ignorance, to connect people or divide them, to empower individuals or concentrate power in the hands of a few. Gutenberg's legacy reminds us that individual actions matter, that seemingly small innovations can have world-changing consequences, and that the future is not predetermined, but depends on the choices we make today. The man who made it possible died in relative obscurity, but his legacy lives on every time someone learns to read, every time an idea spreads across the world, and every time ordinary people claim the right to think for themselves. Johannes Gutenberg gave humanity its voice, and we're still learning how to use it. It's Christmas Eve, 1906. The world is dark and silent in ways we can barely imagine today. No phones buzzing in pockets, no voices streaming through screens, no music floating from invisible speakers. The only sounds are the wind, the creak of wooden ships, and the lonely tap, tap, tap of Morse code cutting through the static like desperate fingers knocking on the door of eternity. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a cargo ship drifts through black waters. Below deck, a wireless operator sits hunched over his equipment, his face lit only by the amber glow of vacuum tubes. His name is lost to history, but his experience that night would change everything. For months, he's heard nothing but those cold, mechanical dots and dashes, ship to shore to ship, numbers and coordinates and brief, businesslike messages that carry no warmth, no humanity. He adjusts his headphones, expecting more of the same. Instead, something impossible begins to flow through the crackling static. A voice. Clear, warm, unmistakably human. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to men of good will. His hands freeze on the controls. This can't be real. Voices don't travel through empty air, but then comes something even more miraculous. Music. The sweet, haunting melody of O Holy Night, played on a violin, floating across hundreds of miles of ocean like a gift from heaven itself. The operator begins to weep, not from sadness, but from a joy so overwhelming he can barely breathe. For the first time in months at sea, he doesn't feel alone. A human voice has reached across the void to remind him that somewhere, somehow, other hearts are beating in rhythm with his own. This is the moment when everything changed. Not just technology, but the human soul itself. This is the story of how we learned to make the invisible speak, how we conquered loneliness, and how a simple invention revealed the deepest truth about who we are as human beings. That our greatest need isn't for food or shelter or safety, but for connection, for the sound of another voice saying, "You are not alone." But our story begins long before that Christmas Eve miracle. It starts with a collection of dreamers and madmen who dared to believe that the very air around us could carry the most intimate whispers of the human heart. In 1860, while America tore itself apart in civil war, a quiet Scottish professor named James Clerk Maxwell was scribbling equations in a cramped university office in Edinburgh. Maxwell wasn't thinking about war or politics or the great events shaping his world. He was thinking about something far more mysterious: the invisible forces that hold the universe together. His equations were beautiful, elegant, perfect. They described how electricity and magnetism danced together in waves that could travel through empty space at the speed of light. His colleagues admired the mathematics, but they couldn't see any practical use for such abstract theories. What good were invisible waves that no one could touch or see or hear? Maxwell died in 1879, never knowing that his mathematical poetry would reshape human civilization. But 20 years later, a young German physicist named Heinrich Hertz decided to prove that Maxwell's impossible waves were real. In his laboratory, surrounded by crude coils of wire and primitive spark gaps, Hertz performed an experiment that seems almost magical even today. He created invisible waves in one corner of his room and detected them in another, proving beyond doubt that Maxwell had been right. Electromagnetic waves really could travel through empty space, carrying energy and information across the void. When reporters asked Hertz about the practical applications of his discovery, he shrugged. "It's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right. We just have these mysterious electromagnetic waves that we cannot see with the naked eye, but they are there." He couldn't have been more wrong. Within a few years, those useless waves would unite the world. The man who first glimpsed their true potential was born into privilege, but chose the path of obsession. Guglielmo Marconi came into the world in 1874, the son of an Italian landowner and an Irish mother who indulged his passion for electrical experiments. While other wealthy young men pursued literature or law or the military, Marconi spent his days in his father's attic, surrounded by wires and batteries and strange devices that clicked and buzzed with mysterious purpose. In 1894, when Marconi was 20 years old, he read about Hertz's experiments with electromagnetic waves. Something ignited in his mind, a vision of invisible signals carrying messages across vast distances, connecting continents, linking hearts separated by oceans. While other scientists saw Hertz's work as an elegant curiosity, Marconi saw the future of human communication. Day after day, night after night, he worked in that attic like a man possessed. His equipment was primitive. Spark gaps and aerials and crude detectors cobbled together with the desperate passion of someone who could see a miracle just beyond his fingertips. His family thought he was losing his mind. Servants whispered about the young master who spent his days talking to machines that seemed to talk back. But Marconi's madness had method. Each day he extended the range of his signals a little further, first across his room, then across the attic, then across the estate grounds. Each success fed his obsession. Each failure drove him to work harder, to dream bigger, to push the boundaries of what seemed possible. The breakthrough came in 1895. Marconi rigged a gun to fire automatically when his receiver detected a signal from his transmitter. He placed the gun behind a hill, completely out of sight from his transmission point. If electromagnetic waves could really pass through solid matter, the gun would fire even though no direct line existed between transmitter and receiver. The moment of truth arrived. Marconi activated his transmitter and held his breath. From beyond the hill came the sharp crack of the rifle. His invisible waves had passed through solid earth as if it were made of nothing at all. The barrier between here and there, between sender and receiver, between heart and heart, had been shattered forever. But when Marconi tried to interest the Italian government in his invention, he met only bureaucratic indifference. Italian officials couldn't see the military or commercial potential of invisible messages. Interesting, they said with polite yawns, but what practical use could it have? Frustrated but not defeated, Marconi packed his equipment and his dreams and sailed to London, where his Irish connections helped him gain access to British officials who proved more visionary than their Italian counterparts. In 1896, Marconi gave his first public demonstration to the British Post Office. The officials watched in amazement as messages traveled instantly across distances that would have taken hours to cross on horseback. The implications hit them like a thunderbolt. Ships could communicate with shore stations. Military units could coordinate across vast battlefields. News could travel faster than the fastest train or the swiftest horse. The British immediately grasped what the Italians had missed. They granted Marconi his first patent and provided him with resources to develop his invention further. The Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company was born, and with it, the commercial radio industry that would reshape the world. But as Marconi's fame spread, other brilliant minds were working on similar problems. In America, a Serbian genius named Nikola Tesla was developing wireless systems that made Marconi's equipment look like children's toys. Tesla was a visionary whose imagination soared far beyond practical concerns. Where Marconi saw wireless telegraphy as a better way to send messages, Tesla envisioned a world where information would flow freely to everyone, everywhere, without cost or restriction. Tesla's public demonstrations bordered on the supernatural. In his New York laboratory, he would illuminate light bulbs without any visible connection to power sources, seemingly drawing electricity from the air itself. Reporters called him a wizard, a man who had tamed lightning and bent the forces of nature to his will. Tesla dreamed of a global wireless system that would make all human knowledge instantly available to anyone, anywhere, a vision that wouldn't become reality until the internet age, more than a century in the future. But Tesla's greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. He was too far ahead of his time. His ideas were so revolutionary that investors couldn't understand them, and what they couldn't understand, they wouldn't fund. While Tesla chased impossible dreams of wireless power transmission and global communication networks, Marconi focused on practical applications that could be sold to real customers with immediate needs. The first dramatic proof of wireless communications' life-saving potential came in 1899. Through thick fog off the English coast, a British warship rammed the East Goodwin lightship in a collision that should have been a minor footnote in maritime history. But this lightship was equipped with one of Marconi's wireless sets, and in the minutes before the ship sank, the operator managed to tap out a desperate distress call. The message flashed across the dark waters at the speed of light. A nearby vessel picked up the signal and raced to the rescue, arriving just in time to save all but one of the crew members. Suddenly, wireless wasn't just a clever invention, it was a guardian angel, a voice that could reach out from disaster and summon help from across the empty miles. Shipping companies that had dismissed wireless as an expensive novelty now fought to equip their vessels with Marconi's equipment. The ocean, which had swallowed countless ships and sailors without a trace, could no longer hide its victims in silent anonymity. As the new century dawned, Marconi set his sights on an even more ambitious goal. He wanted to send wireless signals across the Atlantic Ocean itself, a distance so vast that most scientists declared it impossible. The Earth's curvature would block radio waves after a few hundred miles, they said. The Atlantic was simply too wide, the challenge too great for the primitive technology of the time. Marconi didn't listen to the experts. On December 12, 1901, he stood on a windswept cliff in Newfoundland, Canada, holding a wire antenna attached to a kite that danced high in the Arctic air. More than 2,000 miles away, across an ocean that had defeated every previous attempt at instant communication, his assistants in Cornwall, England were transmitting a simple Morse code signal, 3 dots representing the letter S. Through the crackling static in his headphones, Marconi heard something that changed history. 3 faint clicks. Then again, and again. The letter S had crossed the Atlantic Ocean through empty space, proving once and for all that distance was no barrier to human communication. Critics immediately denounced his claim. Leading scientists said he was deluded, that he had heard atmospheric noise and mistaken it for signals. The scientific establishment couldn't accept that their theories about radio wave propagation were wrong. But Marconi knew what he had heard. More importantly, he understood what it meant. In that moment, listening to those 3 faint clicks, he realized that the world had suddenly become a much smaller place. The age of global instant communication had begun. Within 5 years, commercial transatlantic wireless service was operating regularly. Ships crossing the ocean maintained constant contact with shore stations. Messages that once took weeks to cross the Atlantic by steamship now made the journey in seconds. The global economy accelerated, international diplomacy became more fluid, and families separated by oceans suddenly felt closer than they had in decades. But even as wireless telegraphy revolutionized long-distance communication, visionaries like Reginald Fessenden were dreaming of something more intimate, more deeply human. Morse code was efficient for transmitting information, but it was cold, mechanical, impersonal. Fessenden imagined voices traveling through the air, music floating across continents, the full warmth of human expression conquering distance itself. Fessenden was a brilliant but difficult man, a Canadian who had worked for Thomas Edison before striking out on his own. Where Edison was practical and commercially minded, Fessenden was theoretical, always pushing toward the impossible. He understood that to transmit voice and music, wireless technology would need to evolve far beyond the simple on-off signals of telegraphy. Working with limited resources and increasingly skeptical investors, Fessenden developed what he called continuous wave transmission. Instead of the crude sparks used in wireless telegraphy, he created smooth, steady radio waves that could be modulated to carry the complex patterns of human speech and music. It was an enormous technical leap that required precision engineering at the very limits of early 20th century technology. His experimental station at Brant Rock, Massachusetts became his laboratory for the impossible. His goal was audacious beyond measure, to prove that voice and music could be transmitted wirelessly with enough clarity and power to be useful for practical communication. The first successful voice transmission came in 1900, when Fessenden spoke into his primitive microphone and heard his own words echo back from a receiver just 1 mile away. It was a modest beginning that contained the seeds of a revolution. For the first time in human history, the most intimate form of communication, the human voice itself, had traveled through empty space without wires or cables or any physical connection. Over the next 6 years, Fessenden steadily improved his system, extending its range and clarity, but he knew that to truly prove the potential of voice radio, he needed a demonstration that would capture the world's imagination and prove beyond doubt that the age of wireless voice communication had arrived. That Christmas Eve broadcast in 1906 was his masterstroke, a moment of pure poetry that announced the dawn of a new era. The technical achievement was impressive, but the emotional impact was overwhelming. Suddenly, everyone understood that something fundamental had changed, that the world had become a more connected, more intimate place. The sailors who heard that first broadcast carried the story to ports around the world. Newspapers picked up the tale, and within days, everyone was talking about voices that could travel through thin air. The miracle wasn't just technical, it was spiritual, emotional, deeply human. But Fessenden's triumph was tragically short-lived. His investors, obsessed with immediate profits rather than long-term vision, forced him out of his own company through legal maneuvers that left him broken and bitter. By the time commercial voice radio began to flourish in the 1920s, Fessenden had been largely forgotten, a prophet without honor in his own time, his contributions overshadowed by more commercially successful inventors. The man who had ultimately commercialized radio broadcasting was neither an inventor nor a scientist, but a Russian immigrant with an extraordinary gift for seeing the bigger picture. David Sarnoff arrived in America as a 9-year-old boy who spoke no English and lived in a tenement on New York's Lower East Side. He taught himself English by reading discarded newspapers, educated himself in electronics through correspondence courses, and worked his way up from office boy to wireless operator to become one of the most powerful media executives in American history. In 1912, while working as a wireless operator at Wanamaker's department store in New York, Sarnoff gained national fame for his role in coordinating rescue efforts during the Titanic disaster. For 72 hours straight, he remained at his wireless key, relaying survivor lists and coordinating with rescue ships. The tragedy that horrified the world made Sarnoff a household name and demonstrated once again radio's power to connect people during their darkest hours. But Sarnoff's greatest contribution to radio history came in 1915, when he wrote a visionary memo to his superiors at the American Marconi Company. While everyone else saw wireless as a point-to-point communication system, one sender reaching one specific receiver, Sarnoff envisioned something radically different. He proposed what he called a radio music box that would broadcast to thousands of listeners simultaneously. "I have in mind a plan of development which would make radio a household utility in the same sense as the piano or phonograph," he wrote in that famous memo. "The idea is to bring music into the house by wireless. The receiver can be designed in the form of a simple radio music box and arranged for several different wavelengths, which should be changeable with the throwing of a single switch or pressing of a single button." His superiors dismissed the idea as financial madness. Who would pay for programming that was broadcast free to anyone who could receive it? How could such a system ever generate profits? Sarnoff's visions seemed like commercial suicide. But World War I changed everything. The global conflict demonstrated radio's strategic importance as governments used wireless systems to coordinate military operations across vast fronts. When the war ended, thousands of trained radio operators returned to civilian life with technical skills and a deep appreciation for radio's potential. More importantly, the war had created a generation of electronics manufacturers with the capacity to mass-produce radio equipment. Companies that had built wireless sets for the military suddenly found themselves with factories full of equipment and expertise, but no government contracts to sustain them. The stage was perfectly set for radio's transformation from a specialized communication tool to a mass medium. The spark that ignited the radio revolution came from the most unlikely source imaginable, a Westinghouse engineer named Frank Conrad, who had been conducting informal voice experiments from his garage in Pittsburgh. Conrad's broadcasts were wonderfully amateur affairs. He played phonograph records, read news items from the local paper, talked about the weather, and chatted about whatever happened to strike his fancy that evening. But local radio enthusiasts began tuning in regularly to Conrad's homespun programs, and he found himself with an unexpected but devoted audience of listeners who eagerly awaited his nightly broadcasts. Word spread through Pittsburgh's growing community of radio hobbyists, and soon Conrad's garage broadcasts had become a local phenomenon. A local department store began advertising amateur wireless sets that were specifically pre-tuned to Conrad's frequency. The ads were successful beyond anyone's wildest expectations. People were actually willing to spend significant money on radio receivers just to listen to one man's informal broadcasts from his suburban garage. Westinghouse executives suddenly realized that David Sarnoff had been absolutely right all along. Broadcasting wasn't just technically feasible, it was commercially viable. There was a real audience hungry for radio entertainment, and that audience was willing to pay for equipment to receive it. On November 2, 1920, Westinghouse launched KDKA, America's first commercial radio station with live coverage of the presidential election returns. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of people across Pennsylvania and neighboring states stayed up all night listening to election results transmitted through the air. Many were hearing radio for the first time, and the experience felt genuinely magical. Disembodied voices bringing news from distant places, making every listener feel personally connected to history as it unfolded in real time. Within months, radio stations were sprouting up across America like wildflowers after spring rain. Department stores opened dedicated radio departments staffed by technical experts. Manufacturers couldn't keep up with exploding demand for receivers. Radio clubs formed in every major city, bringing together enthusiasts who shared their passion for this miraculous new medium that was transforming daily life. The programming in those pioneering days was wonderfully eclectic and experimental. Stations featured everything from live classical concerts to agricultural reports, from children's bedtime stories to stock market updates. Ministers discovered they could deliver sermons to congregations far larger than any church could hold. Politicians found they could address voters directly in their homes, bypassing newspapers and party organizations. Musicians reached audiences that dwarfed the capacity of any concert hall or theater. But it was radio's intimate, personal nature that truly captured people's hearts and imaginations. Unlike newspapers or movies, radio came directly into the home, creating an unprecedented sense of personal connection between broadcaster and listener. Families began gathering around their radio sets each evening, sharing experiences with invisible entertainers who seemed to speak to them individually, personally, as friends. The most successful early radio personalities understood this intimacy instinctively. They didn't perform in the theatrical sense, they conversed. They created the powerful illusion that they were speaking to each individual listener personally, one friend talking intimately to another across the mysterious invisible bridge of radio waves. One of the most beloved figures of early radio was a man who called himself simply the voice of experience. His real name was Marion Sale Taylor, and he had lived a life packed with adventure, heartbreak, and hard-won wisdom. He had been a war correspondent in Europe, a foreign correspondent covering revolutions and disasters, a globe-trotting adventurer who had seen the best and worst of human nature. But when Taylor came to radio, he spoke not of exotic places or famous people, but of the universal experiences that touch every human heart. Love and loss, hope and disappointment, the small victories and quiet defeats that make up most people's everyday lives. Night after night, the voice of experience would read letters from listeners who shared their deepest problems and fears. His responses were gentle, wise, and profoundly human. He reminded isolated listeners that they were not alone in their struggles, that others had faced similar challenges and survived, that the human spirit was stronger than any temporary setback. In an age before psychology was widely accepted or professional therapists were readily available, radio provided a form of mass counseling that helped millions of people cope with the stresses and anxieties of modern life. The medium's intimacy made it perfect for this kind of emotional support. Voices speaking directly into people's homes, offering comfort and wisdom in the dark hours of night when loneliness felt most overwhelming. The impact of radio on American culture was immediate and profound. Popular songs that might have taken months to spread across the country now became nationwide hits within days of their first broadcast. Political candidates could address the entire nation simultaneously, fundamentally changing the nature of democratic discourse. News events were shared instantly, creating a shared national consciousness that had never existed before in human history. The 1920s became known as the golden age of radio, but it was also a time of fierce competition and constant innovation.
The most successful radio shows of this era understood the medium's unique strengths and limitations. Amos and Andy, a comedy show featuring two African-American characters voiced by white performers, became so phenomenally popular that movie theaters would interrupt their films to broadcast the show. Department stores played it over their public address systems to keep customers from leaving during the program's scheduled time slot. Radio drama flourished because the medium forced listeners to use their imaginations in ways that no other form of entertainment could match. Without visual elements, radio shows had to paint vivid pictures using only words, sound effects, and music. The results were often more powerful and emotionally engaging than anything that could be shown on stage or screen, because each listener created his or her own personal, customized vision of the story. The greatest radio dramas didn't just tell stories, they created entire worlds in what became known as the theater of the mind. Shows like The Shadow, The Lone Ranger, and Mercury Theater on the Air became cultural phenomena, creating characters and catchphrases that transcended their medium to become permanent parts of American mythology. But radio's greatest moment, its finest hour as a democratic medium, came during the darkest period in modern history. As fascism rose in Europe and the world slid inexorably toward global war, radio became the primary weapon through which democracy defended itself against tyranny and hatred. Leaders like Franklin Delano Roosevelt discovered that they could speak directly to their people, bypassing hostile newspapers and political intermediaries to create an intimate, personal bond with millions of listeners simultaneously. Roosevelt's fireside chats fundamentally redefined the relationship between government and citizen in democratic societies. Instead of formal speeches delivered to crowds from distant podiums, Roosevelt spoke conversationally, intimately, as if he were sitting in each listener's living room explaining complex issues in simple, human terms that anyone could understand. His warm, confident voice reassured Americans during the Great Depression's darkest days and psychologically prepared them for the terrible trials of World War II. The transformative power of Roosevelt's radio presence became dramatically clear during his very first fireside chat in March 1933, just 8 days after his inauguration. The country was paralyzed by a banking crisis that threatened to destroy the entire American financial system. Panic was spreading like wildfire, and many feared that American democracy itself might not survive the economic catastrophe. Roosevelt went on national radio and explained the banking situation in terms that any listener could easily understand. He acknowledged the crisis honestly and directly, but projected absolute confidence that workable solutions were at hand. Most importantly, he asked personally for the American people's cooperation and trust. He began, "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be." The response was immediate and utterly dramatic. When banks reopened the day after Roosevelt's broadcast, deposits exceeded withdrawals for the first time in months. The panic subsided almost overnight, not because the underlying economic problems had been magically solved, but because Roosevelt's radio presence had restored public confidence in American leadership and democratic institutions. Dictators like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini also understood radio's immense power, but they used it in fundamentally different ways. Where Roosevelt sought to inform and persuade through reason and emotional connection, the fascist leaders used radio to manipulate and intimidate through fear and mass hysteria. Their broadcasts were political rallies, not intimate conversations.
carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to overwhelm individual judgment with collective emotion and nationalist fervor. The contrast between democratic and totalitarian uses of radio highlighted the medium's double-edged nature. Radio could be a powerful tool for education, enlightenment, and democratic participation, but it could also be a devastating weapon for propaganda, manipulation, and social control. The same technology that brought families together around their living room receivers also enabled demagogues to reach directly into homes and poison minds with hatred, fear, and destructive ideology. The most frightening demonstration of radio's potential for mass manipulation came on October 30, 1938, when 23-year-old Orson Welles broadcast his now legendary adaptation of H.G. Wells's science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. The show was presented as a series of increasingly frantic news bulletins reporting a Martian invasion of Earth, complete with on-the-scene reporters describing alien war machines devastating New Jersey. Despite several clear announcements that the program was entirely fictional, thousands of listeners across the country believed that Martians were actually attacking the United States. Panic spread like wildfire as people fled their homes, jammed telephone lines, calling relatives in supposedly threatened areas, and demanded immediate protection from local authorities who had no idea what was happening. The incident revealed how completely radio had penetrated American consciousness and how powerful the medium had become in shaping public perception of reality. For many listeners, the voices coming through their radio receivers had become more credible and immediate than the evidence of their own senses. World War II marked radio's absolute pinnacle as a medium for democracy and human connection. War correspondents like Edward R. Murrow brought the reality of global conflict into American living rooms with unprecedented immediacy and emotional power. Murrow's broadcasts from London during the Nazi bombing campaign known as the Blitz didn't just report the news, they made listeners feel as if they were witnessing history firsthand, experiencing the courage and suffering of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Murrow's broadcasts built emotional bridges across the Atlantic, creating bonds of sympathy and understanding that no amount of government propaganda could have achieved. Murrow's most powerful and emotionally devastating broadcast came on April 15, 1945, when he reported from the newly liberated Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. His description of the horrors he witnessed was so vivid and emotionally overwhelming that many listeners wept openly as they finally understood the full extent of Nazi evil.
I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald, Murrow concluded that broadcast, his voice heavy with the weight of witnessing ultimate human cruelty. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. If I've offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least sorry. The war years also witnessed radio's evolution into a truly global medium with profound political impact. Services like the BBC World Service, Voice of America, and similar operations broadcast continuously to occupied territories and neutral countries, carrying messages of hope and accurate information to people living under totalitarian rule. For millions of people trapped behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied Europe, radio became their only reliable connection to the free world, their only source of truthful information about the war's progress and the growing strength of Allied forces fighting for their liberation. In occupied countries across Europe, listening to Allied broadcasts was officially punishable by death, but people risked their lives nightly to tune in to these forbidden voices bringing news from the outside world. Hidden radios became powerful symbols of resistance against tyranny, tools for maintaining hope and planning for the liberation that seemed impossibly distant but remained spiritually alive. The simple act of listening to radio became an act of defiance against totalitarian control, a way of asserting human dignity and the right to seek truth in the face of overwhelming oppression. But even as radio reached its peak influence and cultural importance during the war years, new technologies were emerging that would eventually challenge its supremacy as America's dominant mass medium. Television had been successfully demonstrated as early as the 1920s, but severe technical limitations and enormous economic barriers had prevented its widespread commercial adoption.
The war delayed television's development even further, as manufacturers focused all their resources and expertise on military production. But when the war finally ended in 1945, television technology had advanced significantly, and American consumers were ready for new forms of entertainment and information. Television burst onto the post-war American scene with explosive, irresistible force. The visual element that radio had deliberately excluded suddenly seemed not just desirable, but absolutely essential. Why imagine what performers looked like when you could actually see them? Why listen to a baseball game on radio when you could watch it unfold in real time on your television screen? Radio's creative response to the television challenge revealed the medium's remarkable adaptability and resilience. Instead of trying futilely to compete with television's obvious visual appeal, radio strategically redefined itself as a more personal, portable, and specialized medium that could serve audiences in ways that television never could. The development of the transistor in the late 1940s made small, battery-powered radio receivers economically feasible for the first time, completely liberating the medium from the family living room and transforming it into a constant personal companion that could go anywhere listeners wanted to take it. Radio became the perfect soundtrack to American mobility and the emerging youth culture of the 1950s. Teenagers listened to rock and roll on portable transistor radios that they carried everywhere, to the beach, to school, to drive-in restaurants, the late-night gatherings where they danced to music that horrified their parents but spoke directly to their rebellious young hearts. Commuters tuned into news, weather, and music during their daily drives to work. Factory workers listened to background music while performing routine assembly line tasks. Housewives kept radio playing in their kitchens as they prepared meals and managed households. Radio had evolved from a family activity centered around a piece of living room furniture to an intensely individual, personal experience that could accompany listeners through every aspect of their daily lives. The rise of rock and roll in the mid-1950s gave radio a powerful new sense of purpose and cultural relevance. Disc jockeys became celebrities and cultural influencers in their own right, creating distinctive on-air personalities and devoted followings that sometimes rivaled those of the musicians whose records they played. DJs like Alan Freed, who actually coined the term rock and roll, and the legendary Wolfman Jack didn't just play music, they created entire cultural movements, introducing white audiences to African American musical traditions and helping to break down racial barriers through the universal language of rhythm, blues, and rock and roll. Radio also became increasingly specialized and targeted during this period, with stations focusing on specific demographic groups and musical tastes rather than trying to appeal to everyone simultaneously. Instead of attempting to be all things to all listeners, successful stations concentrated on serving particular audiences better than any competitor possibly could. This strategic specialization allowed radio to survive and ultimately thrive in an increasingly crowded and competitive media landscape that included not just television, but also long-playing records, improved sound systems, and other forms of audio entertainment. The 1960s brought fresh challenges and exciting new opportunities for radio as a medium. FM radio, which had been largely ignored and underutilized for decades, suddenly became culturally and commercially important as listeners discovered its dramatically superior sound quality and freedom from the static that plagued AM broadcasting. FM's technical advantages made it absolutely perfect for the complex musical arrangements and sophisticated production techniques that characterized the era's most innovative popular music. Progressive rock stations on the FM dial created a genuine alternative to the commercial pop music that dominated AM radio, introducing adventurous listeners to longer songs, experimental sounds, and underground artists who would never have received airplay on mainstream commercial stations. These experimental FM stations became cultural laboratories where new forms of music and artistic expression could develop and flourish without the commercial constraints that limited AM radio programming. They created communities of listeners who shared not just musical tastes, but entire worldviews and lifestyle philosophies. Radio also played a crucial, often underappreciated role in the social and political movements that defined the turbulent 1960s. Civil rights leaders used radio stations, particularly those serving African American communities, to coordinate protests, spread information about demonstrations and boycotts, and build emotional connections with supporters across the country.
Underground and alternative radio stations provided essential forums for anti-war activists, counterculture voices, and other dissenting perspectives that were systematically ignored or actively suppressed by mainstream commercial media. These stations became lifelines for people who felt alienated from conventional American society and were searching for alternative ways of thinking and living. The medium's unique ability to reach people quickly, personally, and intimately made it an ideal tool for organizing social change and building communities around shared values and common goals. When Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington in 1963, his words were carried live by radio networks to millions of listeners who couldn't physically be present, but felt spiritually connected to that historic moment through radio's invisible threads. Talk radio emerged as a powerful and increasingly influential format during the 1970s and 1980s, giving ordinary citizens direct access to public discourse in ways that had never existed before in human history. Shows like Larry King Live and countless local call-in programs created new forms of democratic participation, allowing regular people to question politicians directly, debate important issues with fellow citizens, and express their opinions to mass audiences. The format's remarkable success demonstrated radio's continuing relevance and unique value in an age increasingly dominated by television and other visual media. Radio offered something that no other medium could match: the ability to create intimate, real-time conversations between hosts and audiences unmediated by the visual distractions and production complexities that characterize television. The human voice, unadorned by makeup or costumes or elaborate sets, remained radio's greatest and most enduring strength. In a world becoming increasingly artificial and image-conscious, radio offered authenticity, immediacy, and genuine human connection. As the 20th century drew to a close, radio faced what many critics predicted would be its final challenge from digital technologies, satellite broadcasting, and internet streaming services. Technology experts confidently predicted that traditional radio would soon become obsolete, replaced by on-demand services that gave listeners complete control over their audio entertainment choices. But once again, radio proved remarkably resilient and adaptable. Local stations continued to provide essential information, community connection, and personal companionship that digital alternatives simply couldn't match. During natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and other emergencies, radio consistently proved to be the most reliable source of immediate life-saving information when other communication systems failed or became overloaded. Hurricane Katrina, the September 11th terrorist attacks, and countless other disasters demonstrated that radio's simplicity and ubiquity made it absolutely indispensable when people needed information most desperately, and other communication systems collapsed under the weight of crisis. Radio also proved brilliantly adaptable to digital technology by embracing podcasting, internet streaming, and other new distribution methods. Instead of being replaced by digital media, radio influenced and fundamentally shaped these emerging platforms. The intimacy and personality-driven programming that had always defined radio's appeal became the template for successful podcasts and online audio services. Today, more than a century after Guglielmo Marconi sent his first wireless signal across the Atlantic, radio continues to evolve, adapt, and thrive in ways that would amaze its pioneers. Satellite radio, digital broadcasting, and internet streaming have dramatically expanded the medium's reach and improved its technical quality. But the fundamental appeal of radio remains absolutely unchanged. The mysterious power of the human voice to cross any distance, to create connection and community, to inform and entertain and inspire. In our current age of screens and visual overload, radio offers something increasingly rare and precious: the opportunity to use our imagination, to create our own mental pictures from words and sounds and music. Radio demands nothing from us except our attention. It doesn't require us to stare at screens or navigate complex interfaces. It simply asks us to stop, to listen, to think.
to feel. The story of radio's birth and evolution is ultimately a story about the deepest aspects of human nature itself, our fundamental need to communicate, to share our thoughts and feelings and experiences, to know beyond doubt that we are not alone in the vast darkness of space and time. When Reginald Fessenden spoke those first words into his primitive microphone on that snowy Christmas Eve in 1906, when his violin music floated across hundreds of miles of dark ocean to reach the ears of lonely sailors, he was fulfilling one of humanity's oldest and most powerful dreams, the dream of making distance disappear, of connecting heart to heart across the empty miles that separate us. Every time we turn on a radio today, every time we listen to a podcast or stream audio content, every time we hear a human voice speaking to us across the invisible electromagnetic waves that surround us constantly, we participate in that continuing miracle. We become part of an ongoing conversation that began more than a century ago and will continue as long as humans have something meaningful to say to each other.
But the greatest legacy of radio's pioneers isn't technological, it's profoundly spiritual and deeply human. They proved beyond any doubt that the most powerful force in the universe isn't electricity or electromagnetic radiation or any form of advanced technology. The most powerful force is the simple, enduring human desire to reach out across the void, to connect with other souls, to say to someone else, somewhere else, in the most fundamental way possible, I am here. You are there. But through this miracle of human ingenuity and the invisible waves that carry our voices, we are together. Think about that for a moment. In a universe that stretches for billions of light years in every direction, where stars are born and die in cosmic cycles that span millions of centuries, where planets drift through space separated by distances so vast that light itself takes years to travel between them, human beings learn to make their voices cross any earthly distance in mere fractions of a second. We took the loneliness that had defined human existence since our species first looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was listening, and we conquered it through the sheer force of our determination to connect, to communicate, to share the experiences that make us human. In a world that often seems increasingly divided by politics, geography, culture, and countless other barriers, radio continues to remind us that the invisible threads connecting us are infinitely stronger than the visible walls that seem to separate us. The airwaves still carry voices of hope, wisdom, laughter, music, and love. They carry the conversations that bind us together as members of one human family, scattered across the globe but united by our shared need to speak and to listen, to tell our stories, and to hear the stories of others. The technology has evolved beyond anything the pioneers could have imagined, but the fundamental human need that drove their efforts remains exactly the same. We still gather around invisible campfires made of electromagnetic waves, sharing stories and songs and news and ideas, just as our ancestors gathered around fires of wood and flame in caves and clearings thousands of years ago. As long as there are stories to tell, music to share, information to exchange, and people who need to know they are not alone in this vast universe, radio in all its forms will endure and flourish. It is far more than just a technology or a medium of entertainment. Radio is a testament to the unbreakable bonds that unite the human family, a celebration of our refusal to accept isolation as the natural condition of existence. The boy who tinkered with electromagnetic waves in his father's attic, the immigrant who saw the future in a radio music box, the engineer who sent violin music across the ocean on Christmas Eve, the war correspondent whose voice carried truth through the darkness of global conflict. All of them understood something fundamental about what it means to be human. They understood that we are not meant to be alone. They understood that distance is an illusion, that silence can be broken, that every human voice deserves to be heard, and that every human heart yearns for connection with other hearts beating in rhythm across the infinity of space and time. In the beginning was the Word, and through the miracle of radio, the Word was given wings to fly across every ocean, every mountain, every barrier that had ever separated one human soul from another. The voices still travel on waves of light,
crossing every boundary, touching every heart, reminding us all that in the grand symphony of human existence, no one has to sing alone. The conversation continues, carried on invisible waves that connect us all, and everyone is invited to listen, to speak, to join the eternal human chorus that began with the first words ever transmitted through the air and will continue until the last human voice falls silent.